So I'm just going to provide a little bit of context in addition to what Jesse mentioned. As we know, COVID is something that has affected us globally and has also inspired a lot of positive change, particularly in the corporate sphere. And it's really been a defining moment in terms of how companies take care of their customers, their employees, and their communities. This is kind of working in conjunction with the trend towards increasingly emphasizing your corporate purpose, your values, and your social responsibility. So we're really excited to hear from our panelists today on how to successfully navigate these kinds of cross-sector partnerships and partner for social good. So I'm going to provide a brief intro on our lovely panelists today. I'm going to start off with Richard, who was previously communications lead at Red Bull. He's worked with brands from Red Bull to Mercedes in guiding their social impact and social innovation strategies, and worked with huge brands in North America and Europe, and also has experience in emerging markets in Africa and the Asia Pacific. He's worked across social gaming, the sports industry, and financial inclusion, and consulted for NGOs, governments, and blue chip brands since he started in Silicon Valley in 2008. So thanks, Richard, for joining us.
Really
I'm also going to, yep.
Just saying thank you. Yeah.
I'm also going to introduce Samira, who is the Global Impact Senior Manager at Salesforce. She works at the intersection of social innovation, impact, and tech at salesforce.org. She's worked across corporates, governments, and the social sector for over 13 years on various social challenges across the Americas, the Middle East, and Asia. She's a former strategy management consultant and is very passionate about topics related to gender and youth empowerment. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And finally, I'll intro myself. So I'm the co-founder of Butterfly Effects, which is a social enterprise dedicated to improving financial literacy in underserved communities. We've partnered with organizations from fintech companies and family-run conglomerates to a bunch of different other tech companies to promote better financial understanding and inclusion. I also currently work at Propellant, which is a strategy design and engineering firm across the world where work on a lot of really cool prototyping projects. But today we're going to talk about corporate social responsibility. So I'm going to start us off with a question for both of you. So can you tell me a little bit about the CSR or CSV initiatives that you are most familiar with, and if they're challenge-based or rolling, or what kind of form they usually take?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one first. I think working across different brands, one of the things that's been really interesting is, particularly when you get into CSR and what those three letters tend to mean, it really comes down to how is a company able to kind of extend their brand in an authentic way to kind of, you know, engage a community, but ultimately it's drawing back to moving the company forward. So I was previously at Red Bull, and we ran an incubator for social entrepreneurs in 5 countries, and we had kind of smaller scale investments in local entrepreneurs in 7 or 8 different countries. And you know, at Red Bull, it was really about how do you elevate these entrepreneurs? How do you, you know, in the same way that Red Bull would give, we'd give wings to athletes, right? Because you've got your Red Bull sponsored athletes. We wanted to give wings to social entrepreneurs, right? And it was, how do you, you know, the social entrepreneur is excellent at driving social change. So how do we help elevate them and invest in their capacity and get them to a point that they can scale, become sustainable, and attract other investment? But similarly, you know, I've seen other organizations, you know, some of the stuff we did with Mercedes through Laureus Sport for Good, you know, for them it was more around leaving community legacy and investing in kind of on the ground grassroots projects. So to kind of wrap the answer, I think what the company wants to achieve in a given market or space is ultimately going to drive the shape of their programs. And I suppose one thing that was really important to me, because I come from a social enterprise background. I used to run my own social enterprise and have been brought into corporates to help bridge that gap. I think it's for people that are trying to create social impact, something very important to remember is companies are not altruistic, right? They're for-profit entities trying to drive value for the business. And so in order to really connect with them and get them to invest in you, understanding what some of their higher level motives might be will help you connect with them. But I think it also helps you understand why their CSR programs look the way they do. So I'll kind of pause there.
Great. Thanks, Richard. That is very interesting to consider kind of the higher level objectives, right? If they are for-profit entities. Samira, curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, sort of building off of this, higher purpose, or this notion of purpose. Mark Benioff, our CEO, likes to say that the role of business is to improve the state of the world, and we view ourselves as being a platform for change. So for us, it's really about how we can use business as a platform for change. And we define that in the broadest sense. So how can we use our technological innovation for sort of social change? How do we use our human capital for social change? How do we use our financial and our intellectual capital for social change? So we're asking that question through the lens of different functions and different activities across Salesforce. As you mentioned, I work at salesforce.org, and salesforce.org's mandate is very specific, or our portfolio is specific. We're the tech for social change portfolio. So we're using the underlying CRM or intellectual property of .com for good. So we have three main cloud products: nonprofit cloud, philanthropy cloud, geared toward corporations, and education cloud. But long story short is each and every sort of department is trying to answer this question through their own lens. So what that's allowed us to do is it's allowed us to create a myriad and a diversified portfolio for social change. So I'm working on sort of the .org, the tech side. How do you support that tech then with pro bono time from our employees to get our customers and our partners up and running? In addition to that, we have within .org Impact Labs, which is really interesting as you think about social entrepreneurship. So not only are we providing sort of the entrepreneurs with technology access at a discounted rate if they're nonprofits and pro bono help, we're also partnering with them on specific topics. Recently, a lab was done on homelessness. And the idea is to bring these entrepreneurs together with leading thinkers and other movers and shakers in this space. So that's on the .org side. And since the infrastructure is broad, just to spend a little more time on it, on the .com side, we also have an impact fund. So it's an impact investment fund that sits under Salesforce Ventures that invests in education, workforce development, tech for change, climate change. Then there's a grant making arm that's thinking about catalytic capital, which is a little bit outside of the sphere of what we're talking about. And then they also have their own sort of lab related function there called Ignite that is working with some of the for-profit enterprises and thinking about how to help them scale up. So it's diversified, but it's also sort of fragmented. So it isn't like one program for social entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs. And I think what's really happened during COVID though, is it's forced us to ask difficult questions about where we want to focus. So, when COVID sort of first hit, we joined this alliance called the World Economic Forum Alliance for Social Entrepreneurs. At the time, it was 50 organizations. Now it's like 80 organizations across sectors. You have corporations, you have labs, accelerators, various intermediaries coming together and asking the question, how can we support social entrepreneurs during this dire period? And so Salesforce has really been thinking about the tech side of that, but you have other great companies like SAP thinking about the procurement side of it, IKEA thinking about their own supply chain and value chain. So it's been really beautiful and interesting to see cross-sector organizations come together and answer this question around moving the needle on the social entrepreneurship ecosystem. And I think it's forced some difficult questions inside though. We have all these different activities. How do we bring it together for a robust offering? And it sounds really great, but as I think you alluded to earlier, Catherine, there's, or maybe before the call started, there's certainly challenges in working across corporations and social enterprises. So I'll pause there on the note of challenges.
Great. Thanks for that detailed answer as well. It's interesting to hear about how all the different buckets that there are kind of collaboration opportunities. I guess the question that people are probably interested in is what has made social impact partners successful in the cases that you've seen and what's made them unsuccessful. So I don't know if one of you wants to take one and one of you wants to take the other. Otherwise, I'll just throw out the first one. In your experience, where have you seen, what factors or criteria or things make social enterprises more successful in these types of collaborations?
I can take the successful one because I think the not successful one is harder. So I'm leaving that for Richard. Successful, I think for us, impact, goal alignment around impact. Like, what is the change you want to see in the world? Clear definition and a shared definition around that is very important. So, just for us, for example, we're more focused on 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals, but we touch all 17. We're more focused on using technology as an equalizer. So, we have these themes that we're focused on. That's first and foremost. And secondly, I would say, then how do you measure that change? Like, how do you think about what does it mean to have an impact in that space? I think alignment around that is important as well. And I mentioned the vehicle or the format being, let's say, technology for us. Like all of the impact investment funds I may or may not have mentioned are cloud-based technologies. So whatever sort of the main programmatic focus area is, apart from impact, alignment around that. What other things have made it successful for us is partnering with organizations that are, for lack of better words, just ripe or ready to use technology in a particular way. They either have a dedicated resource or they have commitment to learning about it or they have the skills. They tend to be of a certain, I would say, I don't want to use the word maturity, but sort of size, orientation, maturity. So I think for us doing that needs assessment or that discovery up front, like, is this a good partnership? Is this a good match? Saves a lot of time because we can categorize and characterize the enterprise and then have a very realistic and pragmatic discussion of how far we can get with both our technology and the Salesforce infrastructure.
Excellent. So I'm going to throw it to you now, Richard. Feel free to answer the second one, or you can go to the first.
So I think Samira touched on like the first layer, right? Which is, your capability and the criteria you hit as an organization. Perhaps it's the causes you're supporting, your alignment with the UN, etc. The SDGs. I think one of the things that's really interesting. So bear with me. I'll give you a backstory and anecdote. But I started a social enterprise at the turn of the decade, so 2010, and we ran for 6 years. I loved it. It was my life. And we used hockey to raise food for food banks. We were called Five Hole for Food. We raised something like 2 million pounds, about 1 million kilos worth of food in 5 years for local food banks by having a very kind of just millennial friendly event-based model, right? Where we shut down your equivalent of Times Square, set up ball hockey and create a bit of a party around it. And the price of admission was a tin of food for the food bank, or as much as you could give. And when I was doing that, what I remember was really interesting is I was looking for sponsors. Our revenue was sponsorship driven, and I would approach your big beer companies and sports bars and banks, etc. And I remember going into it thinking, this is a no-brainer. Like, we're doing something good. Their messaging is that they want to do something good. So why wouldn't they give us money, right? And it really wasn't till I was 2 or 3 years into that process that I realized, like, one of our biggest sponsors was Molson Coors, a big beer company. And on the surface, it looks like they were investing in us because they wanted to do good. But at the end of and a second sponsor of ours was Boston Pizza, a big Canadian sports bar chain that was in all the cities that we had events. And on the surface, it looks like they want to support you. And this isn't a criticism of companies, right? But on the surface, they want to support you. But ultimately, that support was tied to, so with Boston Pizza, we will feed you. We will cover all your meals across your tour across Canada, but you have to eat in our stores. And it was designed to bring people into the business, right? So I think, once you've got your house in order and you're, aligned to global standards and you've done that stuff that Samira talked about, I think where sometimes we can fall down when trying to align and partner into some of these organizations is we miss that kind of commercial fit. And I'll admit, like, I didn't really understand that until I kind of crossed the line and I went onto like the brand side, because brands, they do want to do good, right? They but doing good is really an extension of driving forward the business. Because at the end of the day, if I spend $1 million on social good ventures in India and I'm Mercedes-Benz, my shareholders are going to come and say, what did you spend $1 million on, right? And unless I can demonstrate the value of that against some KPI within the organization, it's going to be a problem. And so I think a lot of times where organizations fall down, I've fallen down at this hurdle many times when I was running my own thing, is you kind of think that all organizations that do social good are the right fit for you, right? And I think that's where you kind of have to flip it around and realize, do I align with this brand's messaging and their values and the types of things they're wanting to do? So I can talk more specifically to Red Bull now to kind of illustrate this, but for anyone that's looked at the events Red Bull does or the type of content that Red Bull produces, Red Bull's MO is really about being on the fringes of culture, right? Like they've invested originally in sports that weren't mainstream, and they have huge music properties where they invest in like musicians that are underground, and they kind of support culture at that level. If I come in with an idea or a concept that's maybe very mainstream or that actually misses that target of engaging with fringe culture, I'm not a right fit for them, or rather they're not a right fit for me, even if I am supporting causes they're interested in, or I'm aligned with the SDGs, et cetera. So I really think actually one of the biggest disconnects and where things fall down is being able to translate your impact and the kind of value that can create for an organization, translate that into objectives that align with the company's ultimate output. And again, I understand how that can sound very cynical, but actually, like when it comes down to nuts and bolts, that's how these corporations are making their decisions, because it's about moving into markets, moving around markets, et cetera. And I think one thing social entrepreneurs can really benefit from is thinking like a corporate, so that you can translate those things.
Great. Thanks for sharing your thoughts there. I think definitely, it's nice to think that everyone is aligned towards the same social good, but ultimately, other organizations may have other, key performance indicators that they need to make sure are upheld. And so making sure that we have both of those sides in consideration. Going to what Samira was starting to mention with challenges, I'm curious to hear some of the challenges that you faced over time when trying to work with social enterprises, whether that is internal within the corporate itself, or whether that is with the enterprises, externally.
Yeah, I can take that. It actually builds off of what Richard said. I think Richard made an excellent point about there being alignment around beyond cause areas, this sort of cultural fit, this chemistry, and social entrepreneurs thinking like corporations, all very, very important. I think where things kind of have been challenging for me, let's say internally, is although all of that is true, I think a lot of the corporate agenda, if it isn't, it should be defined by empowering your employees to speak up on causes they care about, by having them interact more with social entrepreneurs who fit outside of the cultural mold you're pursuing, who fit outside of your articulated strategy, because it expands your mind. And I'll get more specific with that. Like in COVID, I realized how much I care about marginalized populations and harder to reach geographies and markets in Asia and otherwise. And our approach has previously been very much focused around hubs where we already do business and areas like education and workforce development. But there are some marginalized communities that are suffering tremendously due to the pandemic. So I was constantly internally trying to find ways to tie our existing strategy back to my desire and what I'm passionate about. And I think the more that corporations can empower their employees to have an influence on the overall strategy and changing it and expanding that, the better. And a lot of it happens in partnership, like with my finding entrepreneurs who are working with, let's say, an Acumen Fund or an Ashoka, who are really touching those populations and bringing those stories to life internally. I think that's where the conversation starts to change. So to your question about challenges, I think it's challenging, like when Richard said, when there isn't that alignment, there isn't that fit with what leadership is articulating. So how do you really bring those social entrepreneurs into the fold? And I've had a really hard time with, just to be completely blunt, with specific geographies that are outside Europe and the US. Like wholesale, I've had a hard time with it. There's just fewer resources, fewer people interested. I think it changes as your scale and scope increases. Like Microsoft is huge, Google is huge, they have a different footprint. So that sort of alignment and driving that change internally is tough. And then another thing is tough is that social entrepreneurs are sometimes looking for commitments and answers that, and I think Catherine, you may have said this before the call as well, that we don't really readily have. So if you're on this journey together, and it may seem like, oh, that corporation is flaky, you know, Samira is not necessarily like helping me or returning my calls, but I know that they're not going to benefit from something I'm offering, or there isn't the right place for them, there isn't the right fit. So it's a lot of conversations, relationship building, chemistry building over time. And I think oftentimes people fail to appreciate how time intensive all of that can be.
Great. Yeah, thanks for talking a little bit about the internal organization too, because I'm sure people are always wondering, how does it look inside the organization? I think throw it back to Richard there if you have any other thoughts.
I mean, challenges, we'd need like a separate 3-hour call to like really talk about all these challenges. I think some of the most common ones I've seen are one, retention of internal champions. So really, you know, I look at some of the most successful venture like collaborations between companies and social change organizations, and it's come from having a very senior decision-making champion. And the challenge is when that person leaves, or if for whatever reason they're unable to continue championing it, that can not just be a bottleneck, it can be a deal breaker. And it's a shame, but thinking about how to actually kind of future-proof corporate relationships if you're a social impact organization that's partnered with one is something to think about. But that's also for us as, you know, people in the corporate world, how do you build that sustainability internally? I think I hate that this is an answer, but it's always an answer. But like one of the biggest challenges is like sustainable funding, right? Like particularly for early stage social entrepreneurs that don't have very well-established revenue streams that can kind of balance things out. And then you get one great partner and maybe they're 80% of your revenue. And then if they disappear, like there's a real risk there, right? And I tell you, like I've racked my brain for years on like, what is the solution to funding? Particularly because, you know, I've worked for a couple of big funding organizations. And the problem is every time our strategy changes, that impacts downstream the grantees that get money, and they either try to change their strategy to continue fitting our funding streams, or they then lose out, right? And I think, because I like to be solution oriented, I think one of the things companies really need to do, and I was really excited because we were doing this at Red Bull, was we need to invest in organizations for a longer period of time. You know, I don't think 1 year, 2 year grants and things like that are long enough to really help them level up. And so the challenge is sustainable funding. I think the flip side is longer term engagements. And then I think the third thing that I see as a challenge in a lot of these partnerships is a lot of social entrepreneurs, social impact organizations. And this comes back to, you know, Samira's exact words of like thinking more like a corporate. You need an exit strategy, right? Now, what that looks like is going to be different for everyone, but, you know, particularly the way that the corporate world is moving right now, there are really great opportunities if you have a certain type of product or solution to look at how your exit strategy is actually within the existing supply chain of a corporate you partner with, right? So how can you actually slip into the way they do work? I think that's a natural exit strategy. It's not going to be for everyone, but I think this idea of once you get funding, once you build to a certain size, like where do you go from there? Like, do you just say, you know, I'm happy to operate at this level forever and my revenues generated now kind of sustain me? Or what does it look like? Because that, I'll admit, that was one of my biggest kind of weaknesses when I ran something for 6 years. Was our goal was just to keep getting bigger. And that isn't sustainable. And I think particularly when investment is tied to growth, the idea is that every year we should just do more. You know, whether it's create more impact or whatever, raise more funds, etc. And actually thinking about an exit strategy is really valuable early on, because it's going to shape where you go. So those are kind of 3 challenges for me that I think we could do better at trying to understand.
Excellent. Yeah, no, that's really helpful in terms of, I know that you're being actionable, so having 3 takeaways there. I'm actually going to ask a question that came up in my head as we were talking, so I didn't give you a preview. So if you need time, feel free to take it. So if we talked about thinking like a corporate, right? But what if we think like the startups? So I'm sure there are a lot of people that have a dream corporate that they love to work with, or they have certain sponsor that they love to have, whether it's Red Bull, Salesforce, Microsoft, others. So if you were in that position and you were trying to work with one of those companies, first of like, how would you evaluate what types of partners would make sense? And if you have a specific one, how might you go about trying to engage and start building that relationship?
So can you clarify that again? So if I'm an early stage social investment organization that wants to partner.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess it's regardless of stage, right? Because you could be at any stage and you have kind of a partner that you want to work with. So let's say, you know, running a social enterprise, I really want to work with Red Bull, you know, in your example. How would you go about, you know, trying to start that relationship? I think that's often a point where people don't really know how to start. They have some goals. They don't know, you know, do I just ping them through LinkedIn? Do I go to an event? I mean, how do I start getting in touch?
Right. So it's so interesting, because when I launched 5 for Food, social media was like still the wild west, like, and it was fun back then, right? Like, you know, Google didn't own YouTube, iPhone 2s were still around, and I remember that actually, like, at the very beginning, my first 3 or 4 big sponsors, I actually won because I pitched them on Twitter. So I just, like, you know, that was the day when like CEOs managed their own Twitter accounts, right? And you could do things differently then. But I suppose ultimately, like, the root of your question was like, how do you start building those key relationships and start nurturing them? And what I found has been really effective for me moving forward has been leveraging LinkedIn, but specifically, you know, I get loads of LinkedIn requests from random people I've never met, and the ones that really get me are the people that use their like 280 characters to say something very gripping. And it may seem really obvious, right? But I myself have in turn used that, reached out to complete strangers, but in like 280 characters, kind of hit 3 things. Why am I reaching out to you? Like, what would I like from you? Like, what is that like ask or call to action? And the third bit is personalizing it as much as possible. So what is our connection? What do we have in common? Like, how do I make myself stand out from someone else, right? And very often what I find works is ending it with like a request for help. Like, can I have your advice, right? Because people are always happy to offer advice. You know, someone once told me this early in my social change life, and it's like turned out to be so true. If you ask for money, you get advice. If you ask for advice, you get money, right? So in terms of like building those relationships, it's how do you, like, we have to cold call, especially in this pandemic world where we can't really meet people in person. I find LinkedIn is the best tool for that. Or alternatively, I used to use Twitter a lot, but Twitter's lost its personality in terms of who manages accounts, and it's kind of a big vacuum. But truth be told, you know, the best thing to try and do is convert a LinkedIn cold call into some sort of in-person coffee, because, and I suppose it's also knowing that you're going to need at least 6 to 9 months lead time, right? Like, unless you're sitting on some crazy idea that people are going to jump at right away. All of these relationships that I've built that have turned into partnerships with companies, they take 6, 9, 12 months, because in that time you're learning the company, you're learning where to kind of intersect yourself, and you're building an advocate that will help unlock doors for you. So that would be my approach.
Excellent. No, that's really helpful. I think it's also a situation which, when you need money and you ask for help, it's too late, right? So always planning in advance, multiple. Gonna hand it over to Samira.
Yeah, I can quickly respond to that as well. So completely agree with the LinkedIn idea, but for me, it's more rooted in networks. So however you want to build your network, whether it's through events or otherwise, building your network around the social change that you want to see in the world, I think lends itself well to success in two ways. One, it gives you the credibility, because when I look at, let's say, an enterprise, if they're connected to 2 top accelerators or 3 other enterprises I've heard about, that gives me a lot of comfort, even if they're not really doing anything with those organizations. So just building that network, knowing the right people who are tackling the same social challenges across different sectors is super helpful, whether you want to build that community on LinkedIn or otherwise. For example, for a couple of years, I attended the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network events, AVPN. I think that's a very useful network. So it's not necessarily LinkedIn, but it's in person and online venue. Similarly, as I already mentioned, being linked up with like an Acumen Fund or an Ashoka could be helpful. So figuring out who the right sort of partners are to get those inroads to broader networks, to establish your credibility, and also to learn from others and with others. In terms of corporations to approach, there's the obvious, alignment around industry and cause area. So certain industries are disproportionately either positively or negatively impacting certain cause areas, either by choice or by virtue of the industry that they operate in. So kind of figuring out which industries would be interested in what you're doing, and then thinking about who are the partners who can help you achieve scale. So in all of this, I'm putting aside financing. So for us, for example, cloud-based solutions, obviously we might have a role to play in helping them achieve scale. But before we even get there, I would encourage an organization to think about what are the low-hanging fruit. So especially, let's use Salesforce as an example. I would say, A, are you using Salesforce technology or not? If you're not, can you use it? That's one way, just to start talking to somebody at Salesforce so that you start to figure out who you need to convert in terms of mindset shift to get a champion. And then second, can you develop some sort of mentorship relationship where someone internally at Salesforce is mentoring you, if not on the tech side, maybe on the business side? And then you can start to have those conversations about how you can sort of partner and potentially, a big corporate could help you scale. So I would say low-hanging fruit, thinking about scalability, alignment of objectives. The financing piece, that is, for lack of better words, just super complex and hairy. I agree with Richard that there isn't this nice continuum of catalytic capital all the way to impact investment. I know internally for us, we try to keep our philanthropy separate precisely for the reasons that we don't want to use it for business interest and to, I guess you're still building your brand, but we don't want it to be a business play. We want it to be a philanthropy play. So impact investment is over here and philanthropy is over here. But I've often wondered if we can create sort of a continuum or a bridge, but that's a longer discussion around sort of collaboration.
Well, and I think just to add to that, I think Salesforce is an organization that's a bit more progressive in the way they've structured that. Like when you look at a lot of your more mainstream brands, they're not set up like that. But yeah, totally agree.
Great. Well, great. I think that wraps up the majority of the questions that I had. Thanks for sharing that, by the way, with, just some practical and some more strategic ways of approaching those types of partnerships. Again, I think first step is always just to start trying to reach out and building those networks up. So before we start handing it over to the group, just see if there are any questions. I want to see if there are any parting words before we go into the Q&A.
I think I think if, now is probably the most interesting time in the world to be a social entrepreneur because of just the added complexity that's faced. And I think there's a really important role for social entrepreneurs as we come out of this pandemic and as we either revert to life as it was or this new normal that everyone talks about. I think we're at a really critical juncture in time where corporates recognize their responsibility to enable change, to drive change, to fund change. I think the consumer is more consciously minded, and there is a bit of a perfect storm in terms of the environmental factors to thrive as a social change organization. I'd encourage collaboration. There are a lot of people doing similar stuff, and where we can kind of come together, I think there's strength in numbers. And yeah, I think that we need to lean on each other a bit more. And also I think there's very much this idea of if you don't ask, you don't get, right? So actually coming back to the question of how you network, the thing I do at the end of every time I meet someone new that might kind of be in a space is I ask them, who should I speak to next? And I kind of get that next intro. And that just is 1 degree warmer than a cold call, but it's also quite effective because you're with the person, they're willing to help you, etc. But that principle of don't ask, don't get, I think extends to everything that we're doing. A lot of times when I was running 5 for Food, whether it was right or wrong, I felt like it was a little bit like me against the world. And when you're kind of in that position, you have nothing to lose when you ask, right? And I think sometimes remembering that, in Canada, there's a very well-known phrase from Wayne Gretzky, right? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? But this mentality that the worst thing that will happen if you ask is the person will say no. But more likely than not, they'll try to help you out. And I think just remembering that can open a lot more doors that we thought were once closed.
Excellent. Samira, what about you?
Yeah, I keep saying, building off of what Richard says. So whatever you say it like much more eloquently and with anecdotes, but I'm thinking the same thing. So slightly different angle on what you said. So I was writing an article last night thinking about this very question, like what would I tell a social enterprise to do right now? I completely agree that this is a unique period in time. Corporations have a spotlight on the social entrepreneurship space. And I would say be proactive. So I know social entrepreneurs right now are struggling with cash. So they're probably thinking about the next 6 months, the next year, but I would say much easier said than done. I would say if there is a way to cultivate those medium to longer term relationships right now, it's really going to pay off. So, talking to a Salesforce right now, even if they're not giving you what you need, just starting that journey, because I feel their ears are open, they're listening. I mean, I know certainly we are. So be proactive, knock on doors, beyond funding, just start to develop those relationships now. And then another thing I would just say in terms of parting words is more of a call to action or a request. I would just love to see if you or anybody on this call has resources to learn more about equalizing the playing field for social entrepreneurs, because I'm very keen to see more sort of a global representation, gender representation, and there are people who know their communities very well in very hard to serve populations who have innovative ideas that aren't brought to light. So how do I touch those? How do I access those sitting in like the Bay Area, working at a Salesforce? I would love more information on that. I know there's a quote by Muhammad Yunus that the basically around why the poor people are some of the most innovative people, and they're poor because their hands are tied in a particular way as opposed to a lack of creativity or imagination. And I truly believe that. So I want to kind of transform that paradigm a bit.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that as well. And I'd be also happy to talk to you more about some of those underrepresented communities. So great. Well, thank you so much to our panel for answering all of these questions. I'm sure we could talk about this forever, but since we have limited time, I'm going to check in and see if there are any questions from our participants.
I actually do have a question. So this would be for Richard and Samira. I guess what things do you happen, or what advice would you give to cultivate a short-term relationship, or you know, you're trying to make something happen. How do you make that from a short-term to a long-term? How would you want to cultivate that?
Can you be a bit more like, are you talking about how do you turn a short-term relationship into a longer-term relationship?
Yes. So
yeah, Samira, do you want to go first, or I'm happy to go, and then I can say following on from Samira.
Okay.
Agree with everything you said.
Yeah, I have a quick response, so I can go first. I would say transforming the sort of touch point from, you know, a transactional relationship to more of a longer term mutually beneficial relationship. So for us, primarily I've seen that happen, or for me, is in two forms: mentorship and advisory. So what I've often approached social enterprises with is I'm trying to learn about the community, trying to learn about issues on the ground. I'm trying to raise awareness internally about it. I'm trying to write about it. So I'm coming at it from that angle, and they're often coming to me at it from, how do I work with a large corporation? Like, how do I get business help? How do I get access to technology for free or at a discounted rate? So I'd say turning it from more of like a one-time transaction to, you're on this journey together, and more of a mentorship and advisory relationship. And after a couple of calls with a couple of social enterprises, I've been asked to become an advisor. And I'd say if you like somebody who's sitting at a corporation you want to work with in the future, that's one of the best ways to, you know, get a champion down medium or long term, because they are like sitting within the corporation and can advocate for you.
Yeah, so building off what Samira said, couldn't agree more. But I think this idea of long-term engagement is spot on, and I think as well, in the short term, if you want money, it's often very difficult to mobilize, right? But there's a lot of kind of non-financial support that can be leveraged, right? So how are you asking for something that's harder to say no to, right? How are you asking for time, basically, is one thing. That's like Samira kind of touched on that. And I think the other thing is just looking at how can you engage the person with your outcome. So I don't know what you're working on, or what your project is, but you know, if it's a bit more experiential and it's a service-based output, like how do you get people actually involved in delivery? Like, can they volunteer? Can they contribute? Can they come experience it? You know, this is in addition to being at an advisory or a board level. Because if there's something you can invite people to, you can say, hey, can I invite you and 2 or 3 of your colleagues, right? And that person's then going to invite people they think are equally interested in the cause, or they might be people they're trying to convert as champions internally. But if there's a way to actually engage them in the delivery of whatever you're doing, I think that's one way to shift slow, you know, from short term to medium, long term.
Thank you very much.
I have a quick question. Okay. Richard, you mentioned earlier saying that the problem is obviously that startups trying to reach out to corporates and you know, getting engaged, etc. But my question would be now, did COVID, or I don't know, the recent months make a change that more and more corporates are even more open to support startups and really engage in that? Because here in Hong Kong, I've seen a lot of companies, I would say, opening up more and more, but I would still feel there's still a lot of room for improvement to establish a division or a social impact arm in companies. companies to really engage with the local communities to support them on an impact level. How do you guys, Samira and Richard, see that? Is there a change or same old, same old?
I opened, some of my comments by describing this spotlight on social enterprises and the added attention, which I was also kind of alluding to as a challenge. So basically, I think what I've seen has happened is the sorry about the noise. The rubber is meeting the road. So instead of just like having platitudes of, oh yeah, we should support social entrepreneurs, we care about them, it's like how, where, when, who. These difficult questions are arising unlike ever before because social entrepreneurs and enterprises need it. So because we're being forced to answer those questions, I'm seeing real commitments being put on the table. So I think corporations are committing more, but there is also I'm hearing a lot of no too. Like, no, we're not going to support something in this sort of realm, in this geography. So it's just becoming a lot more tangible and real. So I'd say more attention, but more focus and more clarity. I hope that's helpful.
I think you also need to look at industry, right? Like big tech's doing great, the money's flowing, and subsequently there's investments. I think you look at certain other industries that rely so heavily on footfall and people, and they're not the ones that they're not able to invest. I do think though, what is kind of universal across across organizations that are thriving or barely surviving, is the fact that everyone is a lot more kind of fiscally conscious. And so I think if you are to succeed with any kind of partnership or seeking investment, you need to focus very heavily on presenting a very solid kind of value proposition, right? And what is that return on investment for the investing organization? I think it's hard right now to kind of talk about are organizations more likely to invest in startups or not. I think it's really sector by sector. And the ones that are struggling, they're right now just trying to survive. They've had huge layoffs and, they need to kind of preserve their status to when this vaccine hopefully saves us and kind of, allows us to return to normal. So I'm sure that's not the most satisfying answer, Roy, but that's kind of where I think it is it's a bit of both.
Excellent. I'm going to round this out with a question from Jessie, which maybe we can pick one. Let's see. Okay, the second one maybe. Her question is, how can startups equalize their roles in terms of being partners rather than just agencies in response to the corporate's demand once they enter a partnership? And how do they adhere to their theories of change while working with corporates? I guess like not getting pulled too much off their axis just because they have to somehow fulfill the objectives or align with that corporate's purpose as well.
I think the short answer is think of, I talked earlier about how like social enterprises really need to have an exit strategy. Ask yourself, what is my exit strategy, right? And then work back from that and say, okay, based on my exit strategy, who are the types of people I need to partner with? And then when you start having those first conversations of working together, you've got one eye on the shape you want to take this. I think sometimes corporates shape the partnership more than the social enterprise, and that doesn't have to be the balance of power. I do think though, a lot of times you have to start as the agency, that first initial partnership is a bit more one way, but that's where you build trust, that's where you build experience, and that's where you can evolve that into a longer term relationship.
Yeah, so building off of what Richard said, no, I read the other question also in the chat regarding some mistakes that social enterprises made. So I would say you do have to start at in the agency role. and without compromising your values or what you stand for. Because, for example, I'm usually the person who's looking at the vision and the alignment to social impact. And that's what really grabs me, the passion, the story. It's so different. It'll, bring some sort of new color and value to what Salesforce is already doing. It's sort of like a great health related platform or education related platform. But then when I start to bring it internally and ask for resources, whether they be financial or non-financial, I get asked very specific questions about how it relates to Salesforce's current technology, how it relates to their agenda, how they will make it alive and show value of whatever that enterprise is doing to like our COO or somebody who has a very sort of specific plan for the next fiscal year. And so I've been through that experience enough times to know how important it is to start with that connection, and that like this is what it does for you, your brand, and how it specifically relates to your product line and how you're creating value in the marketplace. And then obviously drawing the line that if it's pushing your values or fundamentally transforming what you want to do, to scale back. But I do think you're dealing with ultimately a corporation, which is a business. So there will be internal impact champions such as myself who will be thinking much more broad and who are interested in the story, the vision, the impact, but you have so many other stakeholders along the way in a corporation.
Excellent. I think we're gonna wrap it up there then, just to keep us on track. Thanks everyone for joining our panel today, and thank you panelists for going a lot deeper, I think, than we usually go when we talk about corporate partnerships, talking a little bit about the challenges, about some of the hope with COVID placing much more of a spotlight on social impact and the responsibility of corporates. And with that, I think I'll hand it back to Jessie.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's really insightful and comprehensive discussion. I think it's a really fruitful dialogue, building onto each other's points. Love that. So I guess just to end this session, we do have lots of entrepreneurs in our community of impact circles. So we are encouraging everyone to, proactively reach out. And also what we're trying to do in the community is we form task forces. So a couple of like social entrepreneurs or foundations who are tackling the same social issues, such as homelessness. We kind of try to group people in the same community, and with that kind of like strength, we can reach out to the corporates and to present with more like comprehensive report. So that's what we're trying to do in the Impact Circle. And if you're interested, please reach out. And last but not least, I also would like to announce that Impact Circle is launching our own mentorship program. And it's a global program. So wherever you're joining this call, you're welcome to sign up. And the more details, you can search for our LinkedIn page, and the sign up is the cutoff the end of the month. So really encourage you. And Richard is one of our mentors. So we really have, the mentor with rich social entrepreneurship and social impact experience to, willing to give back to the community and really help our social entrepreneurs and social innovators to grow. So with that said, thank you so much everyone again for participating. And I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, and evening, and hope to see you again. Thank you. Oh, can we just unmute ourselves and give a round of applause for our speakers? Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.